So now that you've been introduced to the birds here at New Mexico Wildlife Center and seen what we do in terms of avian conservation, the next part of Celebration of Birds is going to be all about avian conservation. The legislation that has contributed to avian conservation, the tools that are used, as well as some really awesome stories about avian conservation. So to start, I want to talk about some of the legislation that has been passed that has really contributed to history of avian conservation. And the first one, and in my opinion, one of the most important, is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. Before the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was created, birds were being hunted to near extinction for sport or for feathers. And so the great auk and the Labrador duck are great examples of that, as well as the Carolina parakeet and the passenger pigeon. All of them were hunted to extinction for sport or for feathers. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act essentially says that it is illegal to take, and I'll define that in a second, any parts or any whole native species of birds. And so by take, that includes hunting or killing birds, trapping them, selling them, possessing any parts of them. That is considered illegal based off the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And a great success story from this is actually the snowy egret. The snowy egret has these beautiful white feather plumes that were frequently used in women's fashion. And so the snowy egret was hunted almost to extinction because of that. And with the passing of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, it became illegal to hunt them for those feathers. And so that's a lot of the reason why they're still around today, as well as the wood duck and the sandhill crane. Beautiful feathers that were used for women's fashion, and unfortunately they were hunted close to extinction because of that. So what does this mean for you? What does the Migratory Bird Treaty Act mean for you? Basically, it means that you are not allowed to go out in the wild and collect birds or any pieces of birds. So that actually includes feathers, and you might have actually heard us in our previous educational videos say if you find a feather, take a picture and leave it be. And it's because it's illegal to take those feathers from the wild. That also means that if a bird is found injured or orphaned, instead of taking it home and caring for it yourself, you are required to either call and talk to a wildlife rehabilitator about it, put it back in the wild, or bring it to a permitted, licensed wildlife rehabilitator. In order for us to have all of our amazing ambassador birds, and as well as our the ability for our wildlife hospital to function, we have special permits in order to work closely with these birds. We also have permits for the feathers and skulls that we use in education as well. You might be hearing the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in the news a lot, and that is actually because there's been some recent developments with it with our current administration. One really important aspect of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is that it holds companies accountable for what is called incidental take. So incidental take is essentially when birds are killed accidentally due to some building operations or something going on due to a corporation. And so what the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is it holds those companies accountable for those deaths. So it oftentimes incentivizes these companies to work closely with conservationists to ensure that they're performing construction and operations in a way that safely maneuvers around native species of birds. Starting in 2017 and continuing until now, the current administration has been trying to make changes to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that would essentially get rid of those aspects that hold companies accountable. So that would mean that if an oil spill occurs and it kills a ton of birds, that company would not be held accountable. It also de-incentivizes them to work with conservationists and be more careful about the construction that they're doing. Fortunately, there's been a lot of organizations like the National Audubon Society, as well as just states in general, that are fighting back on these changes because they realize this Migratory Bird Treaty Act is the reason why so many of the birds that we appreciate are here today, and removing it could cause detrimental harm to these bird species. So we as an organization are really rooting for the National Audubon Society as well as those other organizations that are fighting, because as an organization that loves birds, we also love the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Now, I wanted to start with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act because it is one of the most comprehensive and influential pieces of government legislation that has helped with avian conservation. But before the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, President Roosevelt actually did some great work in preserving land for birds. And so I do want to talk about that because that's another really important piece to this avian conservation puzzle. A huge cause of decline of most species of birds is habitat loss. With urbanization and transferring land to agricultural land, a lot of really important habitat and nesting areas are being lost for those birds. So in 1903, President Roosevelt actually created the first national bird preserve. And after that, he created so many different more natural wildlife preserves. Those are so important to preserving the land that is so crucial for birds to thrive. And so after that point, a lot of other pieces of land have been set aside for them. And so that is another huge piece to avian conservation, is the preservation of natural land for birds to use. The next piece of government legislation that I want to talk about that has been influential in avian conservation is duck stamps. A lot of you might have heard of that. So duck stamps were created, the first duck stamp was created in 1934. And duck stamps are essentially bought by waterfowl hunters, and it is required for waterfowl hunters to possess a federal duck stamp in order to legally be allowed to hunt. And 98% of the money that is spent on those duck stamps actually goes to preserving wetlands for waterfowl species. So over $800 million has been raised due to those duck stamps. And that money has been able to be used to preserve so many wetlands that are important for waterfowl survival. So now that we talked about a lot of the government legislation that has gone into avian conservation, I want to talk a little bit more about the science side of avian conservation, because both of those are really important to making avian conservation successful. So the first thing I want to talk about is bird banding. Bird banding is one of the most important and prevalent ways of studying bird populations. Essentially what it is a metal band that goes on the leg of a bird. And on that is a unique number to that bird. It's kind of like a social security number in a way, because essentially each bird gets their unique number. And as a bander, the bander is required to report the location, the age, the species, the sex of the bird that they have banded with that number. So if that bird is found in the future at a trapping site with scientists, or if it's found at a wildlife rehabilitation center, or if one of you, a member of the public, finds them dead on the ground, you can report that number, and the agency can see that number and say, wow, this bird was banded on this date in this location at this age, so this bird is now this age, and it migrated or moved this far. And so this helps scientists keep track of the longevity of bird species. So how long are these species living in the wild? How far are they moving? Are they moving across countries, or are they staying in a similar location? It's really important to tracking populations and keeping track of what's happening to these bird populations. And if you ever find a bird down on the ground and you see that it has a bird band, there's oftentimes a phone number or a website on that that can tell you where to report that band. And it's usually the USGS, the US Geological Survey, Bird Banding Lab. That's one of the primary bird banding organizations in the United States. And so they have a whole log from so many years back of all the different birds that have been banded in the United States, and scientists can use that to track those populations. So bird banding has been around for so long, and it is one of the most important, easy ways of tracking bird populations. The next science side of avian conservation that I want to talk about is one that you might not consider science, and that's bird watching. Birdwatching has been around for so long, and just recently it has been really useful for tracking bird populations and timing of birds' movements. There is a website called eBird, and eBird is really cool because it is a program that birdwatchers can input their data of birds that they've seen. They can actually go back as far as the 1900s. If they were birding in 1940, they can input their sightings from a date in 1940. And I've often used it when I go bird watching as well. You go bird watching, you count birds, you identify them, you go into this program, and then you can input the date, time, location, identification of the species, and number of birds that you've seen. And this has been really important in scientists being able to see when birds are arriving in a location. So if a curve-billed thrasher shows up in one location at a certain date, we know, oh, okay, this is when they start to show up here. So that's really important for science. There's also some really cool giant bird watching days that Audubon Society has. One is called the Christmas bird count, and that one's really cool because it occurs for 3 weeks out of the year, December to January, and tons and tons of bird watchers go out during that time and count as many species as they can. In 2018, close to 80,000 bird watchers contributed to the Christmas bird count. And this is really useful because this goes back all the way to the 1900s, and we're able to track how different populations have changed over time. A lot of species that we've seen declining, we know that because of the Christmas bird count, because we've seen numbers go from really high to really low. We're going to talk about the American kestrel and their conservation story in a little bit, but they're one species that was noticed during the Christmas bird count as declining over the years. So bird watchers are a really important part to avian conservation. Their dedication and love of birds makes them so willing to help scientists, and their skills with identification and counting numbers of birds is really useful for tracking bird populations and telling us when something's going on with bird populations. So now that we've heard a little bit about avian conservation and the important parts that have led to avian conservation as it is today, we're going to hear a few stories of birds that have really benefited from the avian conservation effort.